Let's go.
Robin, thank you for
Hi,
being
Andrew.
here. It's lovely to meet you. It's an honor to be talking with you. I have definitely followed your career for many years, but this is actually the first time I think we've actually spoken. So it's a great honor for me. And I wanted to maybe start out by allowing you to sort of provide an update on the things that you're currently working on. People may know you as one of the co-founders of Zipcar, but you have a much longer CV and have been doing a lot since then. So maybe why don't you provide an update for folks who may not be familiar with your work.
Here's the fast version. So Zipcar founded in 2000 and ran it for a number of years. And then I tried my hand at real ride sharing. So going from Boston to New York, sharing a car. And that's called Go Loco. I wasn't successful. I did that in 2007 to 2009. Then I tried my hand at peer-to-peer car sharing, a company called Buzzcar that I launched in France, and we merged late in the game with a company called Drivey that merged with Getaround. Then I did Veniam, which is a vehicle network communications company, co-founded that with a colleague of mine, Joao, and that's still running. It's a very high-tech network communications company connecting, bringing data from the vehicle to the cloud. And if we think about all the connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles, they will be reliant on something like that. And then most recently, I co-founded my first NGO, NUMO, the New Urban Mobility Alliance, a couple of years ago. And it was really to recognize that the whole transportation sector is in this incredible transition, and everyone is being forced to, in cities, to talk about transportation, whether they like it or not, and how can we guide that interest and that discussion towards creating a livable, sustainable, and just world. So all the things that you and I know, now's the time to get people to focus on those things and make the transition we need.
I definitely want to get to some of those things that are on the more recent end of your career. But I wanted to ask you about car sharing really quick, peer-to-peer car sharing, especially. We've seen it sort of go through a lot of different iterations over the last few years. And I'm interested in sort of like what you feel is like sort of like the next steps, do you think, for car sharing? We're seeing just recently Turo decided to go public in the United States. Getaround is making some really interesting moves as well. And I'm just wondering sort of where you see the role of car sharing played, especially sort of in a post-pandemic world as well.
I was just talking about this with a colleague who's doing a peer-to-peer startup in Singapore. If I think of the future of transportation and the future world, we need to all live in a multimodal world where there isn't one thing, a car, that's the only way you can get around. We really need to have this diversity of pieces of opportunity to match our life phases and our life needs. So diversity of needs for how to get around. Car sharing is one of the things that fits into that suite of things. And when I founded Zipcar, I thought a lot about taglines, and one of the ideas was, sometimes I need a car. So I want everyone to use all the sorts of suites of options that start with the easiest and simplest of walking, but sometimes need a car. When I think about Turo and Getaround and Zipcar, I see them as slightly different. Turo really basically is peer-to-peer car rental. And car rental satisfies what I found out the hard way, that in the US, 25% of the adult population will rent a car in a year. So those are a whole bunch of car owners who sometimes need to rent a car, and people who don't own cars who need to rent a car. So I don't really think of Turo. Turo is car sharing, and that is people's individual cars that are being shared, but it's not filling the sweet spot for me of car sharing that I like to imagine that is doing hourly as well as daily, that enables you to live without car ownership. So Turo does that for some people, but as I say, it's really substituting for car rental. Getaround and others like it are doing both, but like Zipcar, offer this opportunity to use a car.
So let's talk about some non-car things, because I feel like that's what our audience here is most interested in hearing about. So in early 2021, you made a case for something called the Freedom Network. And I'm wondering if you could explain to us what that is and why it is that you're advocating for that.
I want to do a story really fast. I bumped into Elizabeth Warren in the national airport going through security. She asked me this question. I said to her, Elizabeth, I'd love to talk to you about your transportation policy. And she asked me this question about gas taxes and what I think about raising them. What was most interesting to me was her response, which was, wow, I'm so glad. I'm really worried about the rural poor. And it got me to thinking about, why do we never see in national presidential campaigns, or even as we're talking about the different infrastructure bills, there is this huge divide, and I want to say a huge divide between rural transportation needs and urban transportation needs. And I really bent my brain over this for a good year, which resulted in this tweet that I put out, this Twitter thread, which was to recognize that over the last 100 years, we have lost what I want to consider is the human right of free, no cost, no license required, no government supervision movement. That I was talking to my 96-year-old mom, and when she was 6, living in a town, Worcester, Massachusetts, she could go where she wanted by herself. She could walk herself to school. And I was talking to an 81-year-old friend of mine who lived in Manhattan, and he would take a bus to school when he was 6. And I just think how we have now, for most of Americans, they can't walk anyplace. They can't get themselves anyplace. And that's why we have this drama when we talk about taking cars out of anything. There's this huge drama over, oh my God, you can't take my car away because I'm 100% dependent for anything in the world on cars. So I really wanted to recreate and bring back this idea of movement, and I think of movement and mobility as access to opportunity as a human right. And we need to bring that to a place where, as I say, you don't need to be rich or to own a car to do it. And that would be this freedom network. Can we create a safe and secure network of sidewalks, cycle tracks, roads, trails that enable me to get initially to essential services? Like, can I go to the food store? Can I go to school? Can I go visit my friends? Can I go to the gym? Can I go get healthcare? Can I go to the post office? But ultimately, a whole bunch of places. And can we provide that for everyone? And to this piece about rural versus urban, there's a statistic that is nationwide, which is 50% of all trips are less than 3 miles. And so that's not just in the city where almost all of my trips are less than 3 miles, but nationwide, 50% of trips are less than three miles. Wouldn't it be just incredible if people who are less than 16 could get themselves without asking their mom, please drive me someplace? Or people who have lost their driver's license, or people who live in a one-car household and that car's out, like you're screwed. Or people who just would like to not have to get in the car to go buy an apple or to take a walk with the dog. So I felt that this idea of a freedom network really has potential for being of huge interest in transforming the mobility for everyone, rural or urban or suburban, like across our infrastructure.
Now, do you see this as you're an entrepreneur? Do you see this as, but you're also in the NGO space as well. Do you see this as an entrepreneurial venture, as an advocacy venture? Where do you see it sort of slotting into?
If we think about, let's take a different angle for a minute. We've also seen the rise of bikes over the last few years with the pandemic, and in particular, before the pandemic and acutely during the pandemic, the rise of e-bikes, right? Electric bikes. And I want to say that almost all of my work is driven by addressing climate change and the 1/3 of emissions contributed by transportation, and this idea of equitable mobility. So if I think about the Freedom Network, there's an advocacy role that we know that people everywhere say, why don't you ride a bike? Because I'm going to get killed. Like, I'm not going to ride a bike because I'm going to get killed. And so, okay, I live in a certain space, I can get an e-bike, and maybe, my 25-year-old son can do it, and my 40-year-old white male can do it, but you're not going to see a whole bunch of other people commuting on their e-bikes. So we really, really, really need to have this safe infrastructure. And coming back to this 50% of all trips less than 3 miles, what we know about micromobility, and we can discuss how to define that, but if I think about electric micromobility as a way that I can get around without needing a driver's license and I can go fast and far, it transforms and has, for me, I'm happy to ride my bike in a 3-mile distance any old time. But when you want me to go 6 miles, I think, probably I'll take the subway, or I'm not really, and when you have an e-bike, it completely expands your willingness to go farther distances and more often. And so it really does transform. And then people who live in places with hills, I mean, San Francisco, who would want to own a bike there? Like, no. Or my daughter, who now lives in upstate New York, and she has an electric cargo bike, and it's 1,000 feet over half a mile to get to her house. But after that, it's up and down. So she has to have her cargo bike to get up that last bit. But it's really transforming. And so I think it takes the electric bikes transform. So to your piece, I see this huge opportunity from a business and innovation standpoint. The transportation sector, like every sector, needs to evolve and innovate to become the simplest, easiest, convenient way of addressing climate change in that sector. So there are endless numbers of innovations to our entire economy, including in the transportation sector. And so for me, it's this infrastructure plus what are all the ways that we can make a multimodal lifestyle where I take the right mode for each and every trip. I don't just walk out my front door and take a car each and every time, no matter what, because that is the most crazy. Taking a 2-ton vehicle to move my 120-pound body is preposterous. It can be electric. It's still a stupid idea. It's never the great idea.
Well, I'm curious to know, like, what role you feel the auto industry has played in sort of warping people's perceptions about the type of vehicle that they need to use in order to get to the places they need to go, especially for like these shorter trips. I can't help but to feel that there is some responsibility that needs to be laid at the feet.
Some responsibility. Yeah, I had a really great Twitter sentence success, which was, over the last 100 years, we've made it safer to cross the ocean than to cross the street. And that is statistically true without question. And we can think of the last 100 years as we built out auto mobility, and we completely transformed our infrastructure to make it safe and convenient and the cheapest and easiest thing to use a car. Like, that has been 100% where we've spent all of our infrastructure money. I shouldn't say 100%. We built some nice subways also. But if I think about the current thing that's happening around the world right now, is how are we going to address climate change in the transportation sector? I know, electric cars. I think, yeah, electric cars, that's good. But also get people out of the single occupancy vehicles into smaller, lighter things. So the auto industry and the economic powerhouse of the auto industry, and I just think it's been an industry that's been on life support for 20 years. And I think, why are we constantly bolstering up this as the end-all answer to jobs when it hasn't been? It feels kind of like the coal industry to me. Like, there aren't that many people that are working in the auto industry, and we keep throwing money at it. And let's have people, why aren't we building public transportation here? Why do we have to buy our electric cars in China, and the batteries in China, and the public transportation cars in China, and the public buses in China, and the e-bikes in China? Like, we've screwed that up. And I think we screwed that up by protecting and listening to the American auto industry that has its ideas about what it thinks is the best.
So it seems like what you're suggesting is that we should be looking to solutions, probably not from the private industry, the auto industry, or necessarily even from the national government, but cities could be seen as incubators for positive change. And I'm just wondering if have you seen any examples of, enlightened choices made by cities?
I'm laughing because just 2 nights ago, I do almost nothing locally because I do more national and international work. But I testified along with probably 50 other people in Cambridge, Massachusetts over a bike lane. So we talk about building out bike infrastructure, and then as Jeanette Sadik-Khan coined, there's bike lash, and then there's this huge revolt. And so I want to recognize 2 things. One, there are cities around the world that are doing unbelievably amazing jobs transforming their 100% car infrastructure to a more multimodal infrastructure. And that is happening everywhere. There's this lane reallocation that is happening to make it safe for bicyclists and pedestrians and public transit to be able to move as conveniently as cars. And cars, as I was witnessing on this call 48 hours ago, the car owners and some abutting retail are outraged and incensed at the amazing bike lobby that has pulled together all these people. And I was just, it is so underappreciated how when you look at our roads, 80%, no, that's the number of people quote, it's made up, I'm sure, 95% of the public right-of-way goes to cars and car storage. And yet in my city and let's say in major cities, in Cambridge, 40% of households don't own a car. So 40% of households don't own a car, yet 90% of the road is going towards cars and parking. So London has done a lot of amazing things, really talking about that ownership, that demographic reality, and switching more things over. And we know, I mean, the issue is, I want to talk about the places that come to my mind are, of course, of all these cities that we always talk about. But because those are the cities that we read about. So, Paris, London, Amsterdam, New York City, Boston, a little bit. But I do think we are seeing in say Vancouver, Canada is just remarkable. I do believe, if we think about Pete Buttigieg, he did some interesting stuff in Indianapolis, right? So I think there are bike lanes and public transportation bus lanes that are now being executed in cities in many places. So it is happening.
So let's talk about micromobility for a second. I feel like, there's a broad definition of micromobility, but it seems like for the most part, we're talking about bikes, electric bikes, and shared bikes and scooters. And I'm just wondering if you feel like that definition sort of encompasses all that we need to know about that, or do you feel like that there's a need to broaden the term?
I think SAE worked with a whole group of people and recently came up with a standard definition of micromobility. And to my horror, and many of my colleagues' horrors, it included vehicles that weighed 500 pounds. It was like up to 500 pounds. And I just thought, whoa, that is... And the reason why it gives me horror is because one of the things that we want to have happen is, I want this micromobility for me, and this opportunity is to be vehicles where, as I say, you don't need to get a driver's license and you're not going to be killing people that you're driving next to. So it's compatible with pedestrians in low density uses. And it kind of fits into these lanes that have already been created that were called bike lanes. And I like to call them micromobility. So I'd like to see a definition of micromobility that is compatible with standard bike use and is compatible for adjacency next to pedestrians when there's not a lot of density. But once you talk about micromobility, that it gets heavier and faster, I feel like now it starts getting murky from a public policy standpoint. What is the name of the e-bike that my husband actually owns?
Well, I was going to ask you, like, if in the U.S. things have a tendency to trend towards faster, heavier.
So what is the one that just come on? Everyone, this bike that I'm forgetting the company name, so I can't talk about it, but just said, we're coming out with one that can go 50 miles an hour. And I just thought, oh my God.
Right there.
What's it called?
Zen Move.
Zen Move.
How many times have any of us been on listened to a podcast and wanted the power to do this?
So VanMoof. So my husband has his VanMoof, and we enjoy the VanMoof, but a VanMoof that can go 50. So in our micromobility definition, as I say, since I want it to be compatible with other bikes, I would say a weight maximum, and I'm going to throw out something, 150 pounds, so you can have some cargo bikes in there and something, and 20 miles an hour tops. So that it can be compatible. But once you're talking about going 30 in the narrow bike lane, you're going to really piss off and hurt some people.
Well, I think that this is a natural tension, right? As these smaller vehicles become more electrified and become faster, you're going to see some tension between the folks that were driving traditional bikes and scooters, reacting possibly negatively to the incursion of these faster, heavier vehicles. Do we need to sort of figure out a new way to incorporate micromobility and sort of the current infrastructure that we have? I mean, it was enough of a fight to get bike lanes that we do have. It seems like restarting that whole process over seems like
you and I, and probably everyone in this call, will have lived through the transformation of the term ride sharing from being hitchhiking to the people's taxi, right? So we saw this transformation. And my colleague, Carlos Pardo, who's on this, listening into this call, when I think about this issue that we're discussing and go to the utopian ideals that I wish policy did, I wish policy directives, so policy regulations and policy around who can be in this lane, would not be around vehicle classification, but around risk classification. So what can go in this lane? Things that are less than 150 miles, go 150 pounds, go slower than 20 miles, less than a meter ride. Done. You can go in this lane. And then we wouldn't have to worry about, is this two-wheeled, is this a skateboard? Is it called the child's toy? Is it a whatever? Like e-bikes also in the US, state by state, are having these issues. What are they allowed on the roads, or how are they regulated? Do they need licenses? All of those things. If we required licenses based on risk and we said who can go in this lane, who we want to have compatible, that would get away from all the amazing innovations that I would love to see without having to redefine them. And it goes all the way back to when I founded Zipcar. Was Zipcar, if it was commercial, could it get commercial plates, and could we park in loading zones? And I think, so it's this whole, how do we define it? So if we get away from that and think, what is the public good that we're trying to, public benefit that we're going towards, a public safety or whatever, and define based on those risks, then we would get away from this crazy situation.
So talking about what's good for the public, and if it's getting people out of cars and using more lightweight, carbon neutral forms of transportation, I think one of the more interesting ideas that we've seen floated is ways that the government can subsidize these purchases, or even just hand out free e-bikes to people. There was a New York Times op-ed recently. I think the title was something along the lines of free e-bikes for everyone. There's obviously policy that's being debated about ways to reduce the price because they can be expensive, which can inhibit the adoption rate amongst people who don't have as much money necessarily. And I'm wondering what you thought about sort of like ways that different policy approaches that we can get more of these vehicles to more people and get them out of their cars.
I would love a moratorium on all highway expansion spending, period. So let's talk. And so with that money that you thought you were going to be doing highway expansion, one, repair existing infrastructure. And while you're repairing that infrastructure, let's address congestion and equity issues. And those congestion equity issues go towards, if people were either taking public transportation or in space-efficient micromobility modes, we wouldn't have to be expanding. Well, as we know, expansion does nothing, but people perceive that they need to expand the highways. So I would love to see, I don't think we should be giving subsidies to people who don't need it, but absolutely let's have, I think we should be for low-income people giving away electric bikes and then complementing that with good storage good e-bike secures and bike lanes. I lost my train of thought there for a minute, but I think we are just, the whole idea that we solve our problems with EVs and highway building is just so wrong. Oh, so here also, if I level the playing field, if I look at all the regulations and policy that really subsidizes car things, so parking, forget those parking minimums, let's get rid of those, and all the things, or when employers are saying, I'll give you a free parking spot or pay $80 a month for parking. At a minimum, it should be, here's $80 a month for transportation. You can choose it to park here, or you can choose it to buy an e-bike, or you can choose it to live in a more expensive place where you don't need to use any transportation to get here. But to at least provide I created with NUMO something called the shared mobility principles. And one of the principles is fair user fees across all modes. And we so heavily subsidize cars and all things car related that when I think about e-bikes and bike infrastructure, fair user fees across all modes, fair taxes, fair penalties, fair fees, and going back to the whole Uber and Lyft treatment and fiasco, those are taxis. And it's also cars. And so we should be taxing them and all cars kind of similarly, or taxing them like all taxis, but it's not a separate classification. So
I think you correctly point out that like there's a lot of emphasis being put on electric vehicles as some sort of like panacea for all the problems that we face. And I'm wondering if you also are concerned at all about the amount of focus that's being placed on autonomous vehicles. I know that you're an advocate for shared autonomous vehicles, and I'm just wondering if you feel like we're focusing so much on cars, whether they're electric or autonomous, that we're going to miss sort of the...
Absolutely, that's what I feel. And so I keep coming back to saying, I want to say I'm not anti-car because that would show me as a hypocrite. I do drive a car sometimes, not very much, but I sometimes go by cars. So I really believe the future is a multimodal, equally convenient way to get around, and that I would choose the right thing for the right time. Shared autonomous vehicles, and my daughter once encouraged me to, I want to rebrand them as faves, fleets of autonomous vehicles that are electric and shared. But they do have a place. They have a place. And if we get the pricing right, I would choose that at certain times. But if we don't get the pricing right, and we go back to our innate human selves, I'm always going to choose the easy and convenient thing, and I'm never going to walk a day in my life. So, I mean, if it's dirt cheap on marginal cost, I will be going door to door in autonomous vehicles, and I'll be sending them out to be my slave and errand runners. And so a future of multi-mobility and getting pricing right across all modes.
Fair enough. Well, Robin, I think we're out of time, and I really appreciate you talking to us and giving us your time here. It was a fascinating conversation, and I hope we get to do it again.
Yep, my pleasure.
It really was a fascinating conversation. I also love that you just called the term faves for fleet autonomous vehicles that are electric and shared. But yeah, I thought everything you said was really fascinating. I loved the kind of talking about, what we kind of describe as a market for miles, right? That, there is a role for cars. Cars are a good invention. Clearly it's better if they're electric, and clearly it's better if they're slow or autonomous and can't harm people as easily. But we tend to just use them for everything. It's like using, chainsaw to cut the butter in the morning. It's just over-serving. So like there's a place for it, and it could feel hypocritical sometimes crusading against them, but really what you're crusading for is sort of right-sizing trips for jobs to be done. So great conversation, guys. Thanks for joining us. We're going to wrap up now on the main stage with closing remarks, but thank you guys. Thank Andrew for being here twice today with only a brief break in between. Thank you, Robin, for coming. And I thought it was a great conversation, and we'll have a recording on YouTube sometime soon and on the podcast as well. Thanks so much, Robin.
Bye. Thanks. It was great.
Bye.